Hello everybody, Loremaster of Sotek here, and I hope you all had a wonderful weekend wherever it is you're spending it, hopefully in isolation and washing your hands and doing all that good stuff. But it is Monday at 7 a.m., hopefully, and that means it's time for the Ogre Q&A to continue. So let's not waste too much time. I did try and clean up a little bit here. So it doesn't look... I just... every time I would sit down to record myself, I was just like, I hate it. So, it's not great, but it's better than it was. Anyway, our first question today comes from Felix... Oh my. Felix Gutierrez? Gutierrez. I feel okay about that one. Do the ogres use diplomacy with any of the races, other races? And if so, what is a major diplomatic event? So yes, first, ogres are the dead central neutral faction in Warhammer Fantasy. So if you have a scale that goes pure order to pure destruction, and then for some reason you decide to throw in another scale of like pure good to pure evil, then the ogres are smack in the middle. They, even the Tomb Kings, who are also technically neutral, the Tomb Kings have a couple of things about their culture that weigh them differently depending on the faction they're dealing with. Ogres do not care who you are. They will deal with and hang out with anybody. Now, the ogres are bullies, you know, they're jerks, and they have no issue trying to push around people that they think are weaker than them. But at the same time, at the end of the day, if the ogres think that there is a way they can get food and money out of a situation that doesn't necessarily involve them killing people, they will take it. You know, they are always open to diplomacy. You can negotiate with ogres, which happens a lot. Probably the best major events that have happened, I can think of three very different examples to give you a good idea. So the first actually has to do with the nations of men. And it's basically that when the Western nations, so the Empire, Kislev, the Border Princes, Bretonia, when all those guys essentially got built up enough that they were able to start traveling through the Badlands, go down through Blackfire Pass and then cut to the east, through the Dwarven realms, they were able to go through the World's Edge Mountains and come out in the Darklands. And they figured out a way to get to Cathay by using the Silk Road, very similar to the one in our universe. But the problem with the Silk Road in the Warhammer Fantasy universe is that it's super dangerous, because not only is it infested with greenskins, but once you hit the Darklands especially, you're going to be dealing with a ton of overworld Skaven. I mean, there will be Skaven along the route the entire way, but there's a lot of Skaven, a lot of greenskins. Beastmen will be everywhere, and of course you have to cut through the Chaos Dwarf Empire to get to where you're going. But the Ogre Kingdoms figured out that everyone also had to go through them. So being the entrepreneurs that they were, instead of just setting up bases and raiding everybody that came through, the ogres figured out that it would actually be smarter to instead basically set up camps on the Silk Road and just tax everybody that came through, but to protect them at the same time. So instead of, because very similar to that, the King of Blackcrag, Gorfang Rotgut, he also just taxes people in exchange for not attacking them, but he doesn't protect them. If you end up passing through Gorfang's territory, you can bribe his lads to get through without them attacking you, but it's not going to save you from anything else, and they might not even hold up to their end of the bargain. Whereas the Ogre Kingdoms are super ironclad about sticking to, like, they're fairly dependable when they give your word. And Grease's Goldtooth, of course, the way that he got so fabulously wealthy was that he controls the Silk Road route. And so he puts enormous taxes on anything that passes through, but the trade with Cathay is so lucrative that any merchant worth their salt can afford it. So Greasus, and granted this was set up before Greasus, the time of Greasus, but the ogres at that time basically figured out it was way more profitable to instead protect the road, make sure nobody messed with those guys. Because if they successfully could make the road back and forth, then that meant more people would come, so they would get more money and more food. And, people would bring them things to barter with and would trade with the Ogre Kingdoms. They really like that. And it got up to the point where now the Ogre Kings will offer full bodyguard detachments. So if you're going to go to Cathay, it is not unusual if you're in a major city where you're going to launch one of those escapades from, usually probably the capital of Averland or Nuln. Sometimes they might start in Altdorf, but that's a little far north. But in any event, they will happily have entire ogre regiments there that are from the Mountains of Morn, who will basically just be for hire for bodyguards. And they'll act as your guide and your protection. We're talking like 40 plus ogres in a group. And they're very affordable because they'll hit you hard once you get there. But they're legitimate. They're iron guts and lead belchers, and they are hardcore ogres that will just come with your caravan and protect you the whole way to Cathay and back. Just because that's how they make their living, and they make sure that you end up where they want you to go, so that you of course have to pay them. Only a very foolish man would try and get through the Mountains of Morn without paying the ogres. Another instance that is kind of on the bad guy side of things is you have the Chaos Dwarves. The Dawizar have a very, very close relationship with certain ogre tribes. Most of the ogre kingdoms trade with them fairly frequently because they are able to get around better than the Chaos Dwarves just because they outnumber them so much. And so the Chaos Dwarves kind of use the ogres as a very, very easy way to get slaves, because the ogres will happily go out and capture a ton of greenskins or warriors of chaos or whatever, empire men, wherever they happen to go, and will bring captives back to whatever, whether it's Zar Nagrund or one of the outpost areas, and they'll trade back and forth, because the Chaos Dwarves have no issue giving the ogres really advanced weapons, just because for them it's not that difficult to make, and it's super worth it. So like the lead belchers, which are ogres that literally carry around full-size cannons and use them as like shotguns. I guess a blunderbuss is better because it's a single barrel. But those ogres almost always are getting those cannons from Chaos Dwarf forges, unless they stole them from a dwarf army or empire army that they beat up. But because regular dwarves will not part with their war machines under any condition if they can help it. Chaos dwarves, they don't. As long as it's not like a demon forged weapon, they don't care. But some tribes have an even better relationship with them. Probably the most famous case, which this might not be canon anymore, just because it was only referenced in one of a very old White Dwarf article. Not insanely old, but a good 15 years old by now plus. The Iron Skin tribe, which is one of the most northwestern tribes in the Mountains of Morn, canonically, in the modern lore, they have a very good relationship with the Chaos Dwarves. But the way that's interpreted in the modern lore is that they trade, they're called the Iron Skins because they get tons of armor and arms from the Chaos Dwarves in exchange for slaves and all sorts of other stuff, and they have a very good relationship. But the Iron Skins nowadays are known more for having a ton of lead belchers and really advanced, and their characters are super well equipped. In the older lore, they were known really well for having a terrifying boss named Gark Ironskin. I believe it was Gark. I had it written. Yeah. And he was a tyrant that rode on top of a mechanized Rhinox. So we're talking which a Rhinox is literally like a rhino, but way bigger. It's kind of like an ancient, I think it's the Megasaurus, I forget what the name is, but there's a primordial ancestor to the rhinoceros, and that's what the ogres ride, in some of them. Granted, the Rhinox is no longer an ogre mount, now it's just a big rhinoceros that pulls around the scrap launcher, so it's like a war machine creature. But in the old lore, the biggest, baddest ogres would ride them as mounts. But they got replaced by the new monsters you can see behind me. Except for the Rhinox is still used for the scrap launcher at least, so we still have the model. But, yeah, he rode on a mechanized one. So instead of being made of flesh and blood, it was made out of like demon cursed metal. It was basically a juggernaut from Korn, but bigger, a lot bigger. And it was super scary. But that's a really famous instance. And then, but you know, so that's a good guys and a bad guys one. But they've had tons and tons of diplomatic events with almost every race in the setting. I think maybe the only race the ogres don't have like a record of working for are maybe the lizardmen, but that's not due to that's not really due to them disliking each other. It's more due to a lack of opportunity of them bumping into one another. So hopefully that answers that. Yeah, diplomacy wise, like if you're ever interested in just fascinating short story, or not short stories, but little tidbits, the Ogre Kingdoms books, or army books and stuff, if you can find them, are awesome reads. They're really funny, just because the ogres will work with anybody. Oh, final good example, the most diplomatic of all ogres, of course, is none other than Golgfag Maneater, the first of the Maneaters, and his whole thing was that he was just a diplomatic boss, but he was more of an advantage taker as opposed to like being really nice or being super reliable. You know, he actually even got the dwarves to really like him because he brought down, if you play through, if you know Ungrim Ironskin's backstory, or if you go watch my Legendary Lord video on him, he was trying to kill this really nasty Greenskin war boss who you actually fight in one of his quest battles in Total War Warhammer. But the way he beat him in Fantasy's lore was that this orc warlord was not only terrifying, but he was very slippery, and the dwarves just couldn't pin him down. And finally he lost because he lost a major battle, but he was still able to get away and was basically recouping for like another fight. And Golgfag was like, I ain't doing this anymore. Like, this is... He kind of saw the writing on the wall, and while he knew the war boss could get away, he's like, nah, I want to profit in this situation. So he fought the war boss, and because if I remember correctly, they got into a dispute over Golgfag eating his goblins, which I can't remember the war boss's name off the top of my head, but basically Golgfag kept eating the camp's goblins, and it pissed off the orc warlord. So they fought each other, and Golgfag ripped one of his arms off and ran away with his ogre contingent. And he went over to the dwarves at Kanak Kadrin with Ungrim Ironfist. Was like, hey, I ripped off so-and-so's arm. I'll join up with you guys. And so he did, and he helped the dwarves just smash that really nasty... It was something Iron Skull, I think. But they smashed that dude's army. And then, when the dwarves were busy wrapping up the greenskins, Golgfag and his tyrants went to the back of the dwarf army and attacked the caravan behind it. So they raided it and took all the dwarves' gold and shit and just ran. They just bolted with all the dwarf shit, and it Ungrim's super pissed, which of course led to Ungrim capturing him later. And Ungrim was actually very fond of Golgfag Maneater, which once again you can learn more in his Legendary Lore video. But I spent way too long on that question. Let's keep going. But hopefully you all enjoyed that. That's probably one of my favorite things to talk about with ogres. Parky Fire. Is breeding for ogres pleasurable like it is for humans? Okay. And can ogres breed with humans and make a half-breed? Alright, so first of all, interesting question, though I understand where you're coming from. There's no official sources on it, but I would imagine that for ogres, it's the same as it is for any species that are of comparable sizes. So for ogres, mating is probably fine, normal. Just two very, very large creatures. As for the second part of the question, that I actually can't answer with confidence. There are no half-breeds in Warhammer Fantasy. It's not a thing. That's a big thing in D&D, not a thing here. That's even a thing in Lord of the Rings, if I remember right. They're half-elves and half-humans. But in Fantasy, no. There are no half-breeds, ever. And the main reason for that is most of the Warhammer Fantasy races were brought up by the old ones. They were basically crafted from them using primordial elements. And each of them was made from something very unique. The only difference being the humans, the halflings, and the ogres. They were kind of made from a similar melting pot, but there is enough of a difference between the humans and then the halflings and the ogres that there's too much of a divide there for anything alive to come out of that. It wouldn't work. It'd basically be very similar to like a human trying to mate with some kind of ape or monkey or something, or a gorilla. Like it just wouldn't work. But that being said, technically the ogres and the halflings are so closely related anciently that it might work. I doubt it, but I don't think that could work without killing the halfling. Just because ogres at minimum are like 8 feet tall and well over like probably 500 plus pounds. So yeah, I don't think it's gonna happen. So I cannot see that ending well for anyone involved. Next up, we've got Marcelo Andres Gutierrez. There we go. How does Grease's Goldtooth manage to keep a hold of his over-tyrant position when he is so fat he can't move by himself? Okay, so this... I love this question because the answers are great. So, the thing is, Grease's Goldtooth, who is the over-tyrant of the ogre, so he's basically the emperor or the king. He is the ogre to which all other ogres have to pay attention to. And he's the first over-tyrant in a really long time. There have been other ogre tyrants, but over-tyrants, but not in a very long time. I think it's been a couple centuries. But it's so... The first part is, it's not that Greases cannot move. It's that Greases chooses not to move. Because Grease's Goldtooth has grown so absurdly wealthy and powerful that he views walking as beneath him. He does not consider it worth his effort or his time, and it is a menial task for those who are too poor to afford being carried. So, and he has literally said that. You know, that's the absolute canon answer. The reason Greases is carried around by an army of Noblars, literally like a carpet of Noblars holding him up, is that, which is horrible for them, and a lot of them die on a very regular basis. But it's literally a huge swarm of Noblars that just leaves a trail of dead behind it from suffocating or exhaustion or getting crushed or whatever. But he refuses to walk just because he can afford not to. He can afford to pay other people to walk for him, just in a really lazy way. So he lays on his carpet of Noblars, and not only that, he is also so wealthy that he refuses to walk across regular ground, or be dragged across regular ground. So the Noblars, if you look at his tabletop model, which I'll put an image up, the Noblars literally have bags and bags of gold that they pour out in front of Greases, so that he's constantly being surfed across a golden road that I presume is picked up behind him. Yeah, he's absurd. I adore Greases. He's one of my favorite characters in the lore. But beyond that, Greases, despite the fact that he is incredibly fat, he is actually really strong. Like, Greases is scary strong. When he decides he wants to move, he can move very quick, like surprisingly quick, and not like supernaturally fast, but he would move a lot faster than you would think he can. And he is insanely strong. There was probably his greatest achievement, like when he really cemented his position as Over-Tyrant, was during probably what is the biggest recent battle for the the Ogres, which was against Greenskins at the Battle of the Firemouth, which was basically like a Black Orc nation had been starting to build up in the Darklands. Like, we're talking so many Black Orcs that they were about to form their own empire with, like, the other Greenskins beneath them. And they were going to try and take out the Ogres and the Chaos Dwarves, but they wanted to take out the Ogres first. And it was scary. Like, it would have been a borderline apocalyptic scenario for a lot of empires if that Black Orc army had gotten going into a wall. But basically, they Once again, you know what? I don't like when I can't remember things. So hold on. It'll take me just a sec to look it up because I know where I'm looking. Battle of the Firemouth. Battle of the Firemouth. I went too far back. That's not history. Here we go. Let's see. He fought with Urk something. Urk Ironskull. Urk Ironskull was his name. And Urk Ironskull was pretty much he was basically another Grimgor. He was a Grimgor class threat / fighter. And the way Greasus defeated him is that when Urk Ironskull, the big war boss, and Greasus finally clashed on the battlefield, the way it ended was that Greasus just dropped his weapon and just lunged for Urk, which just completely surprised him, and he picked him up and just crushed him. Greasus just took him like he was a can of tomato sauce and just went which, it took him a second, but with his bare hands, without the enchantments that he gets from his Scepter of the Sky Titans to further augment his strength, Greasus just literally slowly but surely crushed him to death until he was just like a big thing of tin metal. So yeah, Greasus is nuts. And I think we talked about it at the end of yesterday, but Greasus is so powerful and so majestically large that even Grimgor Ironhide could not kill Greasus without using his own weapon against him. Grimgor had to rely on the Scepter of the Sky Titan, which augmented Grimgor's strength, and he used that to crush and kill Greasus because Gitsnick was not going to do it. He was doomed if he had to rely on Gitsnick. Cole Wallace. Can ogres tame Carnosaurs if they wanted to? They probably have tried it at some point in their history, and I can assure you it did not go well. The problem with big dinosaurs like Stegodons, Carnosaurs, Dreadsaurians, etc. is that reptiles are not the most clever creatures and can be incredibly difficult to understand or predict by those who would attempt to ride them. Carnosaurs especially are so uniquely specialized in being apex predators that the instant they taste some kind of fresh meat, they go into something known as a blood frenzy. And when a Carnosaur blood frenzies, there is nobody that's going to stop them. With the one exception of Krokkar. Krokkar is literally the only character in Warhammer Fantasy lore that's capable of reining in a blood frenzy. Now, in Total War, we don't have to deal with that, thankfully, because a lot of people don't like the rampage mechanic, but it's basically the rampage mechanic. Carnosaurs are always, they're really awesome. And when they would blood frenzy, it was worth it because they'd get more attacks, but there was a chance that they would stop listening to you and go run off, which fun fact, had a game once where my Carnosaur blood frenzied and then got lured into a big pile of quicksand, and I failed the roll, and my Carnosaur fell in the quicksand and died with the old blood, and it was awful. just side story there. But in any event, the Carnosaurs, they're really not good reliable mounts. And the way that ogres tame their mounts is that over many generations they have figured out various ways to get them to behave. So like in the case of a Stonehorn, which the Stonehorns, you could just Google it, but Stonehorns are like the ones with the big horns and they have like their skulls exposed because they're fossilizing because they're so ancient. They're really cool monsters, and I hate them in Age of Sigmar because they're overpowered. But the way an ogre tames one of those in fantasy is that you literally have to bait it to charge you, and then you stand in front of it with a spear, and you have to try and stab it in the eyeball as it's charging you. That's it. That's if you miss, you're absolutely fucked. But if you hit it in the eye, it's the only weak spot on its body, and Stonehorns are so immune to pain, or they think they're immune to pain. They're so unaccustomed to it that when they get stabbed in the eyeball, it actually registers as very painful to them, and it freaks them out. And it basically allows the ogre to, by using that spear, cause them enough agony to basically say, I'm the boss. And the Stonehorn just cows down to him. Which, don't worry about the Stonehorn, they can actually regenerate that eye, which is nuts. Doesn't always happen, but it can. And then the Icehorns, which are these guys, they also basically, there's a system that they go through, the hunters, these guys, will go through to basically capture them and just beat them into submission. The way ogres tame all of their mounts is it's not super kosher. You know, it's very brutal. Trying to do that to a Stegodon or a Carnosaur, it's not going to work. Problem with them is that they're too wild, and you cannot exert any reliable control over them in almost any scenario. You know, if you're dealing... Skinks on a Stegodon lose control frequently when that thing gets into battle. Unless it's an ancient Stegodon, but that takes thousands of years. Or, you know, hundreds of years of being used by lizardmen before they adjust to it. Ogres would be long dead before then. So... unless an ogre randomly got some kind of artifact that allowed him to like take over the mind of a creature, I don't think they would have any success dominating a lizardman mount. That being said, if you ever wanted to make like a tabletop model for that, go for it. It's super cool looking. Next up, which probably is today's last question, Zahondo. What kind of relationship do the ogres have with the dwarves? I know that Ungrim has a grudge with Golgfag, but do they typically get along, or are they belligerent to each other? How do the ogres deal with Skaven infestations? Are they well equipped for them? And my final question is, how closely related are ogres to dragon ogres? Do they have some kind of familial bond, or do they only share the name due to physical similarities? Okay, so three questions. First one. Generally, the relationship between the ogres and the dwarves is not great. Honestly, most of the time, it's very, very hostile. But that is entirely the ogre's fault. And when I'm talking about ogres, I mean the ogre kingdoms. Like, a regular ogre running into a dwarf, probably not going to have any problems. A group of ogres, like man-eaters that wander into the dwarven realms, probably not going to have any problems. They might like, the dwarves don't really appreciate ogres because they don't consider them very reliable, but dwarves are willing to hire ogres if they're desperate. Like that is something they are willing to do, though it's considered not the best idea, just because you can't guarantee that they're not going to backstab you. That's what happened in the final battle for Carrick 8 Peaks. Belagar Ironhammer almost won the war against Scarsnake and Queek Headtaker. Like, he was going to win the war, but he had Goldfag's help to do it with this really elaborate trap. And it went off perfectly until it turned out that Scarsnake had bribed Goldfag more and gave him a better deal. So Goldfag turned on Belagar and just wrecked the dwarves' army. So the dwarves went from winning the war of Carrick 8 Peaks to just losing it immediately after that. That basically led to the absolute defeat of the dwarves and Belagar's death. It was kind of like the big moment where they could no longer fight in defense of their home. Dwarves... But that being said, between the races, there's not too much animosity, but the actual nation of the Ogre Kingdoms, dwarves hate them. And the reason for that is that the ogre tribes are very, very greedy, and they're super greedy. You know, nothing describes ogres better than greed and gluttony. And for them, a dwarf hold is like, oh, like that's orgasmic if they can get their hands on it. And there are dwarf holds in the Mountains of Morn, which we talked about in the Dwarf Q&A series, but all of them are hidden. Like, even the dwarves don't record them on maps. They only record them on like secret maps or maps that have like invisible ink or some kind of gimmick to it. And the reason for that is that if an ogre tribe anywhere in the Ogre Kingdoms finds out that there's a dwarf hold and where it is, they will beeline for it. And they'll tell the other tribes too. And basically, like, a big ogre army will show up and just attack relentlessly. And the dwarves have to either completely wipe them out to make sure they don't spread the word, or just die. And most of the time they die, because they get so overwhelmed by the sheer number of ogres. You know, Grease's Goldtooth has a lot of nicknames. Like, Cetra the Imperishable easily has the most nicknames, but probably second place is Grease's Goldtooth. And one of his names, which I think it's Gate Crusher. They're technically titles, because ogres have like a big name system they add a middle name to their actual full name whenever they accomplish something really cool. And one of his had to do with the ogres went up against a runic door leading into a dwarf hold that they couldn't break. So Greases got so fed up that he just basically grabbed it by the hinges and just ripped it out of the mountain. So he didn't break the door's runes because he couldn't. Instead, he just broke the mountain around the door. And I think that's how he got the name Mountain Breaker or something like that. But anyway, so yeah, not great. As for Skaven infestations, the ogres fight the Skaven all the time. They battle so frequently that it's absurd. And the Skaven hate ogres because ogres are very, very well designed to deal with them. And generally the way that ogres deal with Skaven invasions is that, first of all, Skaven get curb stomped by ogres. Not even a close contest most of the time, because the ogres will not bother going down into their tunnels unless it's like super desperate. But they are more than happy for the Skaven to come up. And what the ogres will essentially do, and what they have done in a really famous set of battles, this is actually a very frequent ogre tactic. What they'll do is they'll either get a bunch of Rhinox, a bunch of Mournfangs, or just whatever monsters they have lying around, like a Thunder Tusk or whatever, which is this guy. And they will basically line them up in like a narrow valley that they know the enemy has to come through. And then when the enemy shows up, they're just like, they just slap the horse or the monster across the back and it just squishes everything. And that's happened to the Skaven almost every time, is that they go out to fight the ogres, and unless they have some kind of really powerful sorcerer or weapon or, arcane artifact from Clan Scryer to help them, they're just absolutely doomed. And even if they do have that, it's not really going to win most of the time. The other thing ogres will do if they're dealing with Skaven is they'll use the Gorgers. And we talked about the Gorgers Friday, but Gorgers they're not blind, but they're used to living like deep, dark beneath the earth in these huge caves, and they're like freakish nightmare creatures that are insanely fast. Like imagine an ogre, but it's purely lean muscle, and it just eats whatever it can get its claws on, and it's just a screaming monster. If you want a good idea of what an ogre is probably, or a Gorger is like, look up, if you're aware of the SCP Foundation, Secure, Contain, Protect, look up SCP-069, I think it is, the Shy Guy. When he, somebody sees his face and he, starts to go after him, that's basically what a Gorger is. And they're very hard to kill, they're very nasty, but they're designed for those caves and the dark beneath the mountains. And if the ogres have a big Skaven problem, they'll just literally take a couple of Gorgers and just set them loose. And they will literally wipe out an entire clan. Because for Skaven, they're nightmare creatures, because they're just as accustomed to fighting in the tunnels, except for they rely on senses, like smell and hearing that are basically superhuman. And they are just nightmare fuel for Skaven, because there's no easy, reliable way to deal with them in the close confines of tunnels. You have to set up a really elaborate trap and hope they don't figure out a way around it. And then for the last question about dragon ogres. So this is actually a really interesting topic that someone even asked me about on Twitter. So the relationship between the ogres and dragon ogres is that when the old ones created the ogres, they must have used something from the dragon ogres to make them. Because the two of them do share that kind... They are related in that sense. Like, the upper body of the dragon ogre is involved in whatever the old one's concoction was to create the ogres. Because it's worth noting, the old ones didn't create life, they didn't snap their fingers and just, you got stuff. What the old ones did was that they would take primordial species on the Warhammer Fantasy planet and using their science and magic, they would basically rapidly, they would select the traits they wanted and then rapidly evolve them. But this is why they had to experiment, because their creations were not perfect. You know, they created the lizardmen, but all of the lizardmen subspecies had flaws. You know, the Saurus are prone to like primordial rages. The Croxagores are very similar in that they have a really hard time like resist all the lizardmen actually, with the exception of maybe I would say the exception of the Slum, but the Skinks, Saurus, and Croxagores suffer from having those primordial instincts in their cold-blooded nature, which is why, you know, Skinks are still skittish. Even though a lot of people, when they read the lizardmen, they're like, oh, so they're like automatons? Well, not really, because they still feel instincts. You know, they still have the desire to survive. They still have the desire to, you know, they can still give in to like battle lust and not hate, not emotions as we understand them because they're alien to us, but emotions as their ancestors will understand. You know, and it's the same thing for ogres. You know, ogres were drawn from the dragon ogres, but we don't know what all they were mixed with, but there's almost certainly a connection there. That being said, the ogres and dragon ogres are very aware of the fact that they're very similar, and they hate each other. They hate each other with a fiery passion that there are no words for. If of all the races that exist in Warhammer Fantasy, the only one that the ogres dearly, desperately despise are dragon ogres, and the feeling is very mutual. They absolutely hate each other, and it's a kill on sight relationship. You know, if you have ogres, the only ogres that will tolerate dragon ogres are chaos ogres, and that's just because of pecking order when you worship the dark gods. But the actual Ogre Kingdom's ogres, the OG ogres, there actually used to be many dragon ogre, I don't want to call them enclaves, but there were many dragon ogre families. Not families as in they procreated, but like as in there were many of them gathered in groups that lived in the peaks of the Mountains of Morn and the Ancient Giant Lands, and the Ogre Kingdoms pushed all of them out. Like, they systematically hunted down and either killed or pushed the dragon ogres further west and north. They basically pushed them into the realm of chaos, the Chaos Wastes, and the World's Edge Mountains. And of course, there are probably still some slumbering in the Mountains of Morn or the Ancient Giant Lands, just because when they're sleeping, it can be very difficult to find them until a storm wakes them up. But yeah, they hate each other. That being said, we definitely don't know if, I mean, for the ogres, they definitely stole some ingredients from the dragon ogres, or maybe used some kind of slaughtered dragon ogres to create the recipe. But we don't know ultimately what the ogre's final design was supposed to be, because they came out half-baked. Like, the old ones were days, weeks, months maybe away from dying when they created the halflings and the ogres. Like, they knew their death was coming, and they had kind of finished humanity. Like, they were at a point where they were like, okay, humans, you know, the Slawn, if they guide them, they'll be okay. And they saw chaos coming. They were like, shit, we need humans are very susceptible to chaos. We need two races. We need something that's very chaos resistant. Not magic resistant, but chaos resistant. And they were like frenziedly trying to create the halflings and the ogres at the same time. And they died. Or vanished, whatever happened to them. So that's how we got them. And that's why they're kind of off. You know, the ogres are surprisingly dumb, but also they're surprisingly dim-witted for creations of the old ones. And of course, they're very vulgar in the sense that they have massive appetites. They're assholes, and they adore violence. Like, they really don't fit with the other old ones' creations, and the halflings are the same. Both of them suffer very, very hard from not cravings, but I guess you could, or I don't know if sin's the right word, but they suffer from compulsions. There we go. Which the ogres have a massive compulsion to eat. The halflings have a very big compulsion to steal. So, you know, ogres are absolute fat-ass gluttons, and halflings are kleptomaniacs. And that's, like, built into their DNA, which is very unfortunate. But the halflings people at least tolerate, because they can't really defend themselves, because they're too little. But like the halflings in Warhammer Fantasy are not like the Shire folk from Lord of the Rings. They are abominable creatures that are vulgar. You know, they're known for swearing profusely and using very unfortunate language that all the other races do not like. And their halflings are, fun fact, halflings are the only non-Slanesh race that will basically sleep with anything. Or at least try it, especially if there's enough alcohol involved. And they're also the tobacco suppliers for most of the planet, because halflings. But anyway, hopefully y'all enjoyed the video. I'll see you guys tomorrow at 7 a.m. for more of this. But hopefully, if I can get the time to do it, I will be recording another episode of Mark of Chaos that will be coming out later today. So we can get hopefully into like a 2 video a day habit. And then maybe have spicy things on the weekend. So thanks again for watching, guys. I'll see you tomorrow. At least I'll see you tomorrow.